I'm Brian Schmidt, and this is Pixelated Audio.
We have ignition.
All right, welcome back to Pixelated Audio, a podcast focusing on game audio, its history, and the people behind it. We're your hosts. I'm Brian, and this is Gene.
Yes, not Brian Schmidt and Eugene Jarvis, but we do have Brian Schmidt here with us today. It's an amazing show. Reached out totally out of the blue. He was very excited to be here, and we're very excited to have him. So please, welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to do this.
Looking forward to it, and we're gonna count how many times we mess up Brian Schmidt and Brian me. So as we go, So I'm really excited. We got a lot of really fun music to go through today. Brian has been a just extremely impactful composer and engineer in game audio over the years. That track we came in with was from a pinball game called Space Station, which was released in 1987. That was the main theme. And what a awesome way to start this episode out, something from a blast from the past. Brian, tell us about this track and Space Station in general.
Yeah, Space Station was fun for me. I actually have one. I was playing it a couple weeks ago, actually.
Oh, nice.
This is actually the first game I did solo. So I was at Williams as an employee of Williams as a composer, sound designer. We also had to do programming back then because it was really, really technical how the sounds were made. But I was excited because it was my first solo machine where I kind of did all the music and all the sound, and got to work with an amazing programmer on the game, Ed Boon, who went on to create Mortal Kombat.
Oh, yeah.
We did a couple games together before I left Williams. But yeah, it was sort of the introduction for me for really diving into FM synthesis for music and the little 8-voice sound chip that we had back then. It was all about, hey, how can we get something that sounds reasonably cool out of a soundboard that, has a $9 sound chip on it.
Nice. And this is, a cool transition because a lot of pinball machines started making the switch over to like the YM2151 and really started becoming more digitized, I guess, the mid to late 80s, right after this sound chip came out. So it's cool that you were able to really exercise the sound chip and, do something really cool with it. So was this back, were you in the Bay Area working at Williams at the time? Or
No, this is Williams. The pinball was in Chicago.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So I was finishing my master's at Northwestern University when I got a call from Chris Granner, who was one of the two audio people at Williams at the time. And he's like, hey, we have a job opening for somebody. We need somebody who can write music and also write low-level assembly language computer code.
Doesn't sound like they gave a very obtuse job opening there. It seems very narrow.
Yeah, it's again, back then it was pretty geeky. Chris Granner and another audio programmer there named Bill Parad had written this audio system for the arcade game board. You mentioned the early Yamaha 2151 FM synthesis chips getting into games. The first pinball machine to do that was Road Kings that Chris Granner did. And they had written this system to allow people to basically create music for these systems. It didn't use MIDI. MIDI actually is not a very efficient way of storing information. So it was this archaic system where we literally would just open up a text editor and line by line, write note by note. It's like type NOTE space C3, which was an octave below middle C, comma 30, which would be an eighth note. And we would just have lists and lists and lists of these notes, and that's kind of what how the music was generally done. So Chris and Bill had written the system all in 8-bit assembly language.
Wow.
And then we got to sort of modify it as it went on. We did a lot of changes for like Black Knight 2000 to there. But yeah, it was a very different era.
Well, I'm curious. We have a lot more music to go through, so maybe we should jump into our next track here before we get too deep in the weeds. But
I wanted to play another track from some of your early work. This is from Swords of Fury. This is another pinball game from 1988. And then once we come back from that, we'll talk a little bit about your background and some of those things. As you're kind of bringing us in a little bit, but we'll deep dive into that.
All right. So this is Swords of Fury from 1988 and the main theme. All right, that was the main theme from Swords of Fury, pinball machine released in 1988. And nice bassy growl on there, really utilizing and exercising that FM chip. I really dig this track. Yeah, just a lot of fun. And I don't remember playing this machine at all. So
No, I think I've seen it once or twice, but I've definitely never played it. But yeah, I love this song. Really cool, epic, almost Tangerine Dream style arpeggiated repetition back there. It is very much, it's what all those 80s synthwave guys are just trying to copy these days.
Yeah, this one was super fun to do. This is actually one of my favorite pinball pieces, actually, is the Swords of Fury. And an artist named Stemage did an amazing cover of this, which is just, it's like, if I had a full studio at the time, I wish I could have made it sound like Stemage made it.
I'll have to tell Grant that you said that. I was literally just talking to him a week ago.
Oh, wow.
It's a small world.
Yeah. But yeah, it was fun because I had a chance to have learned a little bit more about how to really control the sound chip by then, and what was it good at, what does it suck at. That's kind of the trick of those days, was trying to write music that did what the sound chip did well, as opposed to trying to force a style into a chip where it's not going to do that great a job. And that's kind of why the synthwave thing was so cool for this. We had also written some better tools by this time. Mm-hmm. Without getting really technical, there was a song assembler that we wrote that made the process of editing and listening like 50 times faster, and we had a real-time Yamaha synthesizer chip patch editor, where literally as the songs playing on the pinball machine, we could be modifying the parameters of the FM chip to change the way the synth patches sounded. And so that really helped us in terms of fluency.
What hardware were you using to write the music for this chip?
It was a compact 286 PC with 640 kilobytes of RAM and a whopping 20 megabyte hard drive.
Ooh.
That's pretty good.
On fire.
Yeah.
So the little boards that were put into the game had a little 8-bit microprocessor called a 6809 processor, which is the baby brother to a processor called the 68000, which was in the very first Macintosh.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so we would do all of our song editing and sound effect editing, which is, again, song editing consists of opening up a text file and editing lists of notes. And we compile those songs into a binary format on that, compact 286 DOS computer. And then there was a special program that we could take what we created, burn it into a ROM chip, put the ROM chip into the game, mm-hmm. and then we could play the game and hear the music. And eventually we were able to, the process of burning a ROM chip would take 15 minutes or so.
Oh gosh.
And eventually we had something where we could kind of bypass that and load songs directly into the machine. But for a long time, it was,
just like one wrong note, and you're like, well, I guess we better go get coffee or something. Like
that's pretty much what it was.
Well, let's jump back here. We kind of talked about some of the stuff you're doing around pinball and the sound chip, but let's go back into your early upbringings with engineering and maybe your musical background. How did you get started in this kind of new emerging technology?
I feel bad for anybody who's listening that wants to get into the games now, because I really just fell into it. I was a music major. I went to Northwestern University as a tuba major, actually, although I consider bass guitar really my main instrument. I wanted to be a session player. I was positive I wanted to be a session player on bass and tuba. And randomly, my sophomore year of college, the School of Music got this big grant to study 3D hearing, like the whole VR audio thing. That's what they were studying back then, back in 1982. And that essentially, that's where I discovered music technology, and I totally fell in love with music technology. So I finished my music degree, but as a composition major instead of a tuba major. And then I also added a computer science degree to it as well, because I just thought this computer music stuff was so incredibly fascinating. This was literally right about the time MIDI was being invented. There were no digital audio workstations, so it was a lot of Wild West as far as what does digital audio mean and what does computer music mean. And then I was getting my master's in computer music. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, when I mentioned before that I got a call from Chris. And I had been playing pinball my whole life. My mom used to get upset at me for like wasting my allowance. I'd ride my bike up to the university and just spend all Saturday in the arcade, pumping quarters into pinball machines.
Time well spent.
And it's kind of funny because at my interview at Williams, after I interviewed, they took me to a room and they showed me an unreleased pinball machine. It was just going to be the next one released. It was F-14 Tomcat. And they asked me if I wanted to play, and it was like, I was a pinball nerd. It's like, yeah.
It would have blown my little kid's brain if I would have. Yeah.
And I later found out that the fact that I was a good pinball player was among the factors that heavily weighed in my favor. So, again, like I said, I kind of fell into it in that at the time I was heavily studying computer music. There was a job opening at a company for a game that I grew up playing. So
wow,
it was very much in the right place in the right time, but with the right skills and all that stuff too. But
right.
Sure.
Little did your mom know, that all that allowance money was actually going directly to your career.
It was a very satisfying phone call to let her know what my job was. Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. So prior to college, you really didn't have like a technical background or anything.
Well, remember, I'm 60, and it was unusual that in my senior year of high school, they actually had a computer course. So I took one computer course because, again, there were no PCs. Computers were mainframes, these things that only universities or defense labs had. So the high school I was at happened to have a little agreement. So I took a computer course because I thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's very unusual for a high school.
But yeah, there was no place to be able to study or take a computer class.
You didn't have the punch cards, did you, for the...
Actually, my first computer class in college, I used punch cards.
That's what my dad did too. He used to have this long thing of punch cards, and he even saved some, I think. So.
Yeah, you enter your computer code line by line on a punch card. Of course, if you make a typo, you throw the card out. Then you'd take this stack, it's like a deck of playing cards, and you'd hand it to some person behind a window. Then you'd wait for 45 minutes, and you'd get your printout back, and your printout says, oh, and card number 7, you made a typo. I couldn't do anything, and so you fix that, and you give it to them again, and hopefully it runs your program.
If not, you got a really hard time debugging.
Yeah. Now, yeah. To be fair, even back then, that was 1980, I think, or 81. It was a little archaic to use punch cards. So.
Right. Okay. Fair. Yeah. My dad's, significantly older too. So yeah, that was their thing.
Speaking of older devices, one thing, we're not going to have a lot of opportunities to talk about it because of the music is hard to get, but I know that you did have some experience with older mechanical games, redemption games. I saw there are these lots of exhaustive wikis, and you had things listed for some kind of fishing game or skee ball or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Was that work you were doing at the same time, before? What was the story there?
Yeah, so this was after I left Williams. So I was at Williams for about 2.5 years. I loved that job. I loved the people at it. And for some reason that I still can't figure out why, I quit to go freelance, basically. And as a freelancer, I suddenly discovered, wow, there's a lot of companies making these redemption games or ticket games, right? I used to be able to go into Chuck E. Cheese and I'd see at least a half a dozen or 10 games that I did there. And they're just super fun. They're small, they're short. They don't take, weeks and weeks of effort to do. Mm-hmm. they've got cute. They're mostly they're like doing jingles, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's for a composer. You can do feature films or you can do jingles, and so there were those sort of ticket games. The Chuck E. Cheese games for me felt like doing jingles.
Cool. And about how many of those games did you do?
Oh, geez, probably at least 30 or so, maybe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've been joking in our Discord channel that you were basically the sound of my bowling alley experience from like 90 to 96. I mean, like when I started to look in your credits, it's like I played all of those pinball games or, whatever. I've definitely seen a lot of your work floating around. I think that's going to be a running theme in this show about I didn't realize that was actually the same guy, Brian, who was behind all of these different things. I think you just had this kind of pervasive, you just worked on a lot of things that a lot of people interacted with, even if they didn't know you by name, which, as we know, is changing as time goes on. A lot of these composers are getting more recognition, but,
right.
I'm sure at the time you weren't necessarily thinking about it.
No, not at all. In fact, what I sort of later learned is that being freelance at that time as a game audio person was really unusual. For the most part, game composers were employees of companies. Like I was an employee of Williams. The music for Capcom was done by employees of Capcom, and the music for Virgin was done by employees of Virgin Games.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so when I were in freelance, I kind of discovered that, wow, a lot of companies kind of would like to use a freelancer because they don't maybe have enough work to justify a full-time salary for a year for somebody. Again, like a company that makes 2 of these big redemption games, Chuck E. Cheese games in a year, they're not going to pay for a composer as a full-time salaried person.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, so again, I kind of got lucky in that it allowed me to be pretty prolific. And so it turned out that being freelance was a good career move. Even though I miss the people at Williams. I love those people. I learned so much.
It always seems like a better environment to be, amongst peers as opposed to just kind of freelance on your own at probably your own home, for example. I don't know exactly, but, imagine.
Yeah. Hey, before we move on to the next track here, Electric Boogaloo, a good friend and moderator on Discord, had a question about Swords of Fury. He said, I'm curious about your idea to have the main music build and add instruments after each ball unlocked. It's a pretty cool thing, something you didn't hear a lot of pinball tables do all that much. It's something you did also in Space Station. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. Today, if we are using Wise or Fmod, we would call that vertical layering.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You've got a basic track and you add additional tracks, or you essentially remix the track based upon where you are in the game. Part of it was, I definitely because what I would typically do is there's main play theme. Then if one ball is locked, I'd add a part. The second ball is locked, I'd add a part. And then at that point, typically you go to multi-ball after that. So there were those, sort of 4 main game states. And so, I wanted to keep the main theme, but I did want to make sure the player always knew, based upon just the music, what state they were in. Again, 1 ball lock, 2 ball locks, and so on. And to be frank, part of it too was technical. Back then, one of the things that shaped game audio the most, and this is probably true through the early mid 90s, is storage, is memory.
Right.
All of the music has to fit, if I recall correctly, for Swords of Fury, in like a 32 kilobyte ROM.
Sounds right.
And what the layering enabled me to do was have, one song, and that took up a certain amount of memory. But then adding a layer to it, the only additional memory it used was the additional notes for that new layer that is being added.
So like this small delta of...
It's a small delta. Yeah, it's unlike today where you'd have a WAV file and then you'd have a whole nother WAV file that was the same thing, but maybe with additional stuff on it. It was partly, it enabled me to make that differentiation and still live with the 32 kilobyte budget that we had.
Nice. So while we're still on the pinball theme, I want to jump over to a track here. This is from Black Knight 2000, released in 1989, and this is the main theme.
got the power. You got the might.
No way.
Get ready for battle.
Give me your money.
Be the Black Knight. The power. You got the might.
No way.
Get ready for battle.
Give me your money.
Be the Black Knight.
All right, that was the main theme from Black Knight 2000, released in 1989 for the Pinball cabinet. And this is just a very nostalgic song to me. I loved this pinball machine. And yeah, it's great.
I don't know anybody that has played pinball and that has, has even a passing interest that hasn't heard of or played Black Knight 2000. It is up there with like Adam's Family Pinball and a couple of these other ones that's just like pervasive.
The last time I was at California Extreme, I probably spent like 2 hours on just this table.
All right.
I can see that. Yeah, I've lost some time to this machine, and we've got some fan questions about this one. But before I get into that, I have to say, you telling me that you said bass was your primary instrument answers a lot of my questions about why bass features so prominently, why there are bass solos all over the place, and you weren't secretly in a punk band, were you? Because you
no, I at the time actually I was in a progressive '80s band that was trying to make it as a band.
Oh, what was it called?
It's called Security. And,
we're gonna have to find that and get a clip.
I could see the SEO on that one's a little tricky.
But the Google didn't exist back then. You got to remember. Yeah. So yeah, SEO wasn't a thing. Yeah. It's tough to dig up these days because it's terrible SEO name for something like that. But yeah, I typically would write from the bass up. Although this tune's a little bit different because this was the main theme for Black Knight was a collaborative effort. Steve Ritchie, the game designer, is actually a guitar player. And I was so excited to work on this because one of my favorite pinball machines of all time was the original Black Knight. There was a summer where I worked at an amusement park. I played in one of the shows there, and the theater was next to the arcade. And if it wasn't crowded, the operator there would just load me up on credits, and I would just play Black Knight all day long. I would get off if the arcade got busy, but
sure, right.
So to be able to actually work on the sequel was thrilling, and so Steve would come in my office with his guitar. I'd go up to his office, and he'd play some chords or something like that, and eventually we kind of settled on this, and then I wrote the bass line to it because I write from the bass up, and he wanted a choir of angels singing, and he wanted taunting. That's Steve Ritchie is the voice of the Black Knight. So we figured kind of, how to make it work and how to take kind of his chord progression and his theme and make it into a real piece. So it was really fun. And technology-wise and interactive music-wise, this game does a lot of stuff that games even today don't do a lot of. One of the really important things with this game, which we always say in game audio that implementation is half of the experience.
Right.
And by that we mean, hey, you have some music, but how it gets placed into the game and how it gets triggered and how the programmer calls it and makes it happen is really, really important. And for this one, we added a bunch of new technology to the sound driver to enable transitions, and we could add chord markings in the background music so that when a sound effect happens, the sound effect knows what chord the music is currently playing, and it would actually transpose itself to match the chord of the music at whatever time in the music happened to be. If it's currently playing a C chord, then the sound effect will be in C. But if the chord's in the middle, in the middle of the sound effect, the chord switched from C to E, the sound effect itself would suddenly jump a third. And
it really it really kind of puts into focus why some of these pinball games were so evergreen, especially going into the mid 90s. Some of these were still very present. I mean, you guys were pretty ahead of your time in terms of doing a lot of interactive music, and pinball games did not really have the expectation of being the most, I don't want to call them technologically advanced, but they were living alongside arcade games,
right?
And yet you were doing some really clever things. And I mean, hearing about it, it's like I can kind of see it now, but you don't necessarily think about it during the gameplay experience. Just sort of you absorb it because you're so busy playing.
Exactly.
This is all really cool. Yeah,
you absorb it as the right way to put it. And once you put this, from the second you put a quarter in Black Knight, the beat starts, and everything in the game happens to the beat. The musical transitions happen on the beat. The playfield lights are synchronized to the beat. We put in some codes where we could send signals from the music to the main game program that would then flash the lights.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Wow, that's awesome.
I hadn't even considered that, and I'm pretty sure I can visually see it, but I didn't even.
and the most amazing thing, and again, it goes because the entire design team shared the same vision for what the game should sound like. Ed Boon was the programmer in this game as well. It was his last game before he moved over to video games and did Mortal Kombat. But there would even be some times where, let's say when the ball drains, you go into what's called the bonus count sequence, right? That's where you get 1x, 2x, 3x bonus, and it counts the points up. Well, he would wait until a beat boundary to start that. And then even the bonus count sequence was fully synchronized and on the beat. And even to the point, I'm pretty sure, again, this was 30 some years ago, I'm pretty sure that even the next ball kicking onto the plunger, that the solenoid would get fired on a beat boundary. So the entire thing was designed to be the beat never stops. So yeah,
that's pretty incredible.
That and the sound effects that transpose to the underlying chord were kind of the two biggest things. Is that everything audio and visual was tightly synchronized, and then we had kind of the sound effects that would modify themselves. So that we were really proud of that.
That is still a challenge today. I've seen some games that try to incorporate beat related audio, and the fact that you were doing this in 1989 is super awesome.
Well, Metal Hellsinger is all about.
Oh yeah.
But the game that probably came the closest was Peggle 2 from PopCap a few years ago. That really did an awesome job of keeping the timings were all correct, and the sound effects were essentially part of the background music. And so
that game was really addictive.
That is really addictive.
Yeah. We have a quick little follow-up question. This is more of a funny, jokey question. Feel free to fill in some kind of, anecdotes. So this is from user Draconis. Why does the Black Knight keep asking me for money? Does he have a mortgage or to pay off on a castle? Seriously, who came up with these awesome lyrics?
That's,
in essence,
that is Steve. That is, Steve is the Black Knight of Black Knight 2000. Not just the voice. Steve is the Black Knight. Steve has always been the Black Knight.
The Black Knight will slay you.
But the other track, by the way, that is really awesome in this that I wish I had written that I did not, is the multi-ball music. That was actually written by Dan Forden. And it's just an amazing, tense piece of music, which is what you want in a frenetic multi-ball, when you've got multiple pinballs flying around the machine and so on.
Right. Add to the chaos.
But so it was a great collaborative effort. Again, Steve kind of with his guitar, and I was kind of the lead audio director and main composer, but then Dan did the amazing multi-ball music, and Ed Boon put it all together from a programming perspective. So that was a fun machine to work on.
Awesome. Well, we're going to move on to actually going back a little bit in time, but to one of your more infamous games. We're going to be talking about Narc.
Oh, Narc, yeah.
The classic game. It became like a very weird cultural touchstone. We'll talk about that, but we're going to play my favorite track from the game, which is Crack Street, which, strange name aside, is a great piece of music. So we'll listen to that, and then we'll come right back.
Yeah, it's actually not called Crack Street. Whoever posted this video just made the names up.
Okay.
It might have been the name of the level. What is the name of the song, if you have it?
Right, this might be the name of the level. This one was dubbed The Stick.
All right. That was the song The Stick from the arcade game Narc, released in 1988, which I guess plays in the level Crack Street. And boy, is there so much to talk about with this song. It was covered by the Pixies. I'm sure you're getting lots of residuals from that. It was the first, probably not.
It's not their biggest hit, but I was yeah, that was fun.
It was also the first game, infamously, to use the Winners Don't Do Drugs campaign, which many arcade game players are familiar with in the United States, and maybe people who got an illegal copy of an American hardware board somewhere down the line. But yeah, it showed up in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as an indication of this is where the bad kids hang out. This game has a reputation, let's just say.
Yeah, tell us about Narc.
Yeah, so Eugene Jarvis and George Petro were doing this game. It was the first of what we would call a medium res game using digitized graphics, which is, again, this technology that Mortal Kombat, which was a game Williams did after this, would use. So it was, notable for its graphics, which was cutting edge at the time, right, using digitized images that the computer could sort of move around and do things. And it was the first game I worked on with Eugene Jarvis, which was amazingly fun. And they were just looking for kind of the style that I like to do, again through Black Knight, and which I think I had done right before this or right after. I don't remember which I had done first. Now that I think about it.
When you were working on this, did you have any idea at the time that it would take off, or was it just like, oh, seems like a cool game? Yeah, let's work on this.
We were all pretty excited about it. One of the nice things about working at Williams is it was, one of the leading arcade game companies,
Right.
kind of in the world. So it was, a lot of effort goes into every game. They're literally building them and manufacturing them, right? Video game companies then really thought of themselves as manufacturing companies, right? The assembly line was down the hall from the offices, and you could go see people make things. So there wasn't really the idea of work on it, and then just, go in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was. I remember it was fun because it was controversial, and it was in the news a bit. And you can probably tell, the parts are generally written from the bass up. The stick has a bass solo in the middle of it that I kind of couldn't resist doing.
I'm actually working on an arrangement of this track. That was literally, I swear to God, the reason why I reached out to you in the first place. I have a goofy sort of music group that I assemble for our annual video game music thing, MagWest. We did a thing last year, and this year I'm like, I'm going to kick up the stakes this year. I'm doing a track from Narc. And I just kept talking about it so much. I'm like, why don't I just reach out to Brian?
If you do that, I will definitely go.
Yeah, please do. It's July 14th to the 16th. I'll send you the information about that after the show. We'd love to have you there.
That would be amazingly fun. Yeah.
You just got to wear a T-shirt that says "Winners don't do drugs."
I think I might even have one of the original Narc shirts from the
development
team.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
So I hope somewhere I have a box of T-shirts from all games that I did. So I try to keep it airtight.
Preserve those, man.
Yeah. So again, there were all these different levels, and they just really wanted something that was pretty high energy and kind of a rocking vibe. Again, the bass solo was just kind of put in almost as a gratuitous joke, but they're like, oh, wow. So they wanted to leave that. The reason it's called The Stick is because that rock band I was telling you I was in before, for a couple songs, and I played an instrument called The Stick.
The Chapman Stick, you mean?
The Chapman Stick, yeah. So and George and Eugene and I think Ed had seen my band like a couple weeks earlier, and they're like, well, what was that thing that you were playing? And I said, oh, it's a Chapman Stick. And so when they heard the bass solo in this, they dubbed it, oh, wow, that sounds like your stick. So that's how the name became The Stick, which when the Pixies recorded, it was just called Theme from Narc. Because the tracks didn't really have official titles back then.
Were you contacted? I mean, the rights are always a little bit confusing, but were you aware that happened, or did it just release and you're like, oh, okay, I guess that happened?
I wasn't aware that it happened, but Williams obviously was. So by the time it released, I had left Williams. Williams owns it, right? I was an employee of Williams. Williams owns the copyright to the, stuff that I do. And they had gotten me to join ASCAP because Narc, the arcade game, was in a really, really terrible 80s movie, and some of the music played from it. So they were a little bit savvy for music rights, and again, wanted to make sure that I was in the proper performing rights society for it. But this came out of the blue. I literally had a party when I moved into my house, and one of the guests was Eugene, and he just showed up with a disc in his hand. He's like, "Hey, been meaning to tell you." So
nice.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. It bugs me a little bit because if you look on Spotify, if you look under written by, it says Black Francis.
Oh, is that one of the members of?
That's the lead singer for the Pixies, and I contacted them, and they've been very nice, but they haven't not fixed it yet. So
eventually,
they'll
yeah, do their due diligence.
Well, we're here to set the record straight anyway.
All right.
So we're going to jump back over to Pinball for one last thing here, or we have a few actually, but this is a track, and we want to talk about this a little bit in detail. This is from Batman. This is track 1. Let's take a listen. We'll be right back.
I'm Batman.
All right, that was track 1 from Batman, the Pinball Machine, and this is a really cool. I was expecting it, but no, this is it's got its own flair to it.
Yeah, and this game is notable because in addition to working on composition, you're also a hardware designer, and this is all information from Wiki, so I definitely want you to set the record straight. But apparently, this was the first in a series of licensed pinball games that used the BSMT, or the Brian Schmidt's Mousetrap hardware board, which allowed sampled audio or something like that. So tell us about that whole thing.
Yeah. Wow. As you played that, to be frank, I didn't recognize that song. I wrote it.
It sounds just like you, though.
It sounds like me. It sounds like, oh, that's Brian Schmidt. But it's funny. Sometimes you write stuff and you have no memory of it. I just haven't listened to it in so long. As I mentioned, right, the Yamaha 2151, that FM synthesis technology was really dominant in arcade games, going back to Marble Madness. It was the sound chip in arcade games. And so after I left Williams, I was doing work for Data East as a contractor. And a couple things we wanted to do. We wanted to sort of get a different vibe, a different sound than the FM chip, and also have the ability to go a little bit more realistic for instruments. Again, the Yamaha chip is awesome at the synth stuff, but it's not so good at, pretending to be a real drum set or something like that.
Right.
So the technology was about the time where we were able to create a sound chip, which is actually a hard ROM-coded version of a Texas Instruments 320C15 digital signal processing chip.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mentioned that to Gene last night when we were looking it up.
Yeah.
And by the way, I assure you, our listeners do actually enjoy this kind of talk. So
Okay.
Self-edit. Yeah. No, they love it.
Yeah. So what it is, it's a you can build these chips with programs built into them, like burned into them, and you manufacture them like that. And so that's what the BSMT was. And it allowed us to, instead of using FM synthesis, which is generate sounds using pure mathematics, that's what FM is. Instead, we would record little snippets of a drum, a trumpet, a bass, a violin, of actual instruments, and play them back like a wavetable synthesizer was today. So it was an early wavetable synth. It had some limitations. The sampling rate was only 24 kilohertz, which is atrocious fidelity from today's standards. It used companded 8-bit audio data, which is, again, it's technically 8-bit audio, but they're techniques we did to try and make it sound not 8-bit-ish. And I think it only could do 11 or 12 concurrent sounds, something like that. So a little bit more than the Yamaha chip. But yeah, so it was the idea we wanted to have. I wanted real drums. I wanted potentially real guitars, and just have a different sound than what Williams was doing with the Yamaha chips.
Now, did you use this BSMT 2000 with like in tandem with the YM2151, or
no,
was it just completely on its own?
Completely on its own. The one thing I learned early on at Williams is, remember I said that these companies viewed themselves as manufacturing companies, and that meant you had a bill of materials, which is how much does this thing cost?
Right.
And so literally we would have to fight for, hey, can I have one more ROM chip so we can have more speech in this game? Or because each of those chips is $5.
Right.
And if you're making, 150,000 games a year or 100,000 games a year, that starts to add up. So yeah, it was a switchover from the Yamaha to the BSMT 2000.
Got it. And I can't recall if we mentioned it, but it was called the Brian Schmidt's Mousetrap. I'm sure you've got a story for why it's called that.
Yeah, that was Joe Kamenko kind of gave it that name. The 2000 was because 2000 at the time seemed really modern and futuristic because this was in the 90s.
Yeah.
So that chip name didn't age well, I guess.
It's fine. We love that kind of trivia.
Yeah. Mousetrap. What is that about, though? There some reference there?
I forgot who was attributed to saying it. Build a better mousetrap and the world will be the path to your door. It's a saying about inventing things, and So this was
Gotcha.
my invention. Again, wavetable synthesis is not my invention, but the chip, this was the chip that I like, hey, let's do a new sound chip. And again, that's what this board is. It has a BSMT. This board I'm holding up that you can't see because this is an audio podcast.
Oh,
we'll
I'm
get
just
a
going to
picture,
take some
please.
screenshots real
But
quick.
please do take a photo
I'll
of
take
that
a photo
and
and
send it
send
to
it
us.
over.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. We have another track here. This is a really cool one. We want to make sure that we had this in. This is from a game called Checkpoint, or a pinball machine called Checkpoint, released in 1991. The track is called Jazz. Let's take a listen. All right, we're back. That was from Checkpoint. The track was called Jazz, and this was released in 1991 by Dead East. And yeah, it's pretty different from what we've heard so far.
And not to mention, this one had, if I assume based on the titles, different genres of music that you could select as you play, which is a little bit of a different approach for a pinball machine. So love to know more about all that.
Yeah, so this was designed by Joe Kamenko. So at Data East. And he wanted to, since it was a racing game, he wanted to have this notion of a radio station where you could select different kinds of music depending upon what mood you were in. Obviously we do that in racing games all the time these days. I think there were 6. I can't remember all of them.
I think we listened to at least 4,
We
right?
listened to about 3 or 4 of them,
Yeah.
like jazz, country, rap. I can't remember the other way. Rock, probably.
There definitely was classical because I did Brandenburg 6. I just did a Yamaha version of, the switched on Bach version of Brandenburg 6. 6 or 4, I don't remember which. Let's say 6. So yeah, there were the different tracks. And so, yeah, just again, the idea was let's create some different styles. And so for me, this was fun because it's a little out of my normal wheel. I mean, I played tons of jazz as a bass player, obviously, or this is sort of a mellow jazz, not Charlie Parker jazz. But yeah, again, one of the things I like about games is doing different styles of music. I know I kind of had my thing, especially once I hit Data East, because Joe had what he liked. And so I got to the point where I could kind of give him something he'd liked the first time. But the downside of that is it was all starting to be a little similar sounding. But so this one was really refreshing in that it was like these very different styles. The the rap thing, which isn't really rap, but it's more just funky bass line.
Kind of like hip hoppy.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, this was a super fun game to work on. And little trivia fact here is that when you push the start button in this game, there's a voice that goes, "All right, here we go, we rollin'." And that was an ad lib from the voice talent, Fred Young. And was simply referring to the fact that I had told the engineer to press record on the tape deck, and the tape had started rolling. And so Fred was like, "All right, here we go, we rollin'." And
wow.
And I'm like,
It's great B-roll, yeah.
I'm like,
perfect.
Crap, that's good. Okay.
I've been in the studio where stuff like that you just kind of say as an ad lib makes it in some form or another.
It's like 10% of our show, man. Like
that is absolutely true. Yeah. But moving on, and there's not really a supernatural transition here, but we wanted to talk with you about QSound, which is another thing that you worked on, another bit of hardware. There's a lot of just general questions. What was your involvement with the company, with the chip itself? Anything you really want to talk about, that's something of interest. There's actually a lot of conversation about it. So,
oh wow,
yeah,
I didn't realize
tell us
people
about QSound.
Don't remember people still realize what that was. Knew what that was. So right, I had left Williams, and right about the time I was leaving Williams, I got contacted by this Canadian company. They came down. They met me at, I think it was an AMOA show, one of the arcade game shows, trade shows at the time, and they're like, "Hey, we're this audio technology company that's mostly in the record business. But our board of directors thinks that we need to look at video games because there might be something applicable to the video game industry for this technology." And so they flew me up to Calgary where their headquarters were. And I just listened to this amazing demo, where through two speakers, you hear sounds kind of coming from all over the place. And that started, ended up consulting for them for 8 or 9 years.
Wow.
Almost exclusively on the video game side of things, right? Because they were doing deals with Madonna and Sting and things like that, and I was sort of in the little scrappy little video game bit of it. But we ended up designing a custom sound chip, again using a programmable DSP, a ROM-coded DSP. This was an AT&T. I can picture it. I can't remember the model number of it. It was, at the time, it was kind of a cutting edge DSP. And we were able to put into it basic wavetable sample playback technology, very much like the BSMT. And also program in this 3D sound algorithm that they had. And that ended up going into a lot of different Capcom arcade games.
Oh yeah, I know it very well.
That QSound logo.
The QSound logo coming up in Street Fighter. Yeah. But that was really, really fun because I got to spend a lot of time in Japan working with the engineers there, working with the sound team there.
Oh, wow.
I love Japanese food. I started taking Japanese lessons, and so I got very into that, the whole culture there. And it was just fun to see, our job was to sort of shrink this technology, which took, if you want to get really geeky, the Pro system used this rack module with 8 56,000 DSPs on it. And we tried to shrink that down to something that would fit on a single chip that we could make for, $20 or something like that. So,
wow, that's a process.
I wanted to add a little side note because this actually came up in our conversation about QSound, but some of the members of our Discord, Valley Bell and CTR, actually wrote some code to emulate the QSound for use in, emulators and what have you.
Wow.
So it's, it's still alive and well. People really do want to capture that spatial 3D audio that you worked so hard to achieve. So yes, people do remember QSound, to put it simply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
Sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, no, I said a lot of the questions that we had around QSound came from Utopian Nemo. I just want to make sure we call him out because he had a lot of really good questions for you about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One little known fact is that the most listened to, the most watched binaural audio on YouTube, which is Virtual Haircut, I think it's got 40 million views at this point. That was done by QSound.
Ah, yes. As I was saying, all we are doing is using your head as the listening point. And we have 2 microphones, one on either side of the head, in the same position as where your left and your right ears are. Your brain is doing all of the work, telling you where the sounds are coming from. Okay, I'll go get the scissors.
So that was a QSound demo.
Okay.
The voice of the barber, he was the receptionist. His name is Kennedy. I think the guitar player's name was Brad. And that was done as a proof of concept demo, and it kind of got out into the wild. And it got put on YouTube before anybody really knew what YouTube was.
Nice.
So yeah, if you Google virtual haircut, that's actually a dummy head recording that was created by QSound.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I feel like I've seen this before. Huh. Well, awesome.
I'll have to write that in our notes so that I remember to capture that after the fact, because things always come up in these shows that, obviously we wouldn't have any idea about, and I always try to get it into our show notes.
Awesome.
I think we wanted to transition to some of your work on consoles. So we have a couple of tracks here. I don't know, Brian, should we give other Brian pick of the litter here? What do you think? How should we do this? Because we won't have time to play all of them.
Yeah, we have a track here from Crüe. We could jump into some Desert Strike. We got
Madden 95, Weapon Lord. If you got any other suggestions, we're open to them too. I mean, I'm sure there were some fond memories from that era as well.
Yeah, Desert Strike's probably the best known. I mean, that was EA's, I think, best-selling game of '92 or something like that. So that's probably the best known. Although Crüe was fun because it was my first console.
Well, let's play Stage 6 here from Crüe on the Genesis. Take a listen. We'll be right back. That was Stage 6 from Crüe on the Sega Genesis. And wow, face melting.
Yeah, they wanted kind of an in-your-face thing. This was the first console game I actually ever did. It was for Electronic Arts. And I got the gig because the consulting designer on it was a gentleman named Mark Springer, who was one of the artists at Williams that I worked with. And he had left Williams and he was doing some freelance art and game consulting. And so since it's a pinball emulation game, they're like, hey, let's get somebody who actually has done physical pinballs to do it.
That's kind of how I figured, yeah, because it seemed like a pretty natural progression from you to work on physical pinball machines. Another system that has FM sound hardware in it.
Right.
It's kind of like, seems like a perfect match. And on the note of just because obviously this game was very well advertised with music by Motley
Crüe. Yeah.
What is that? Were you involved with them directly, or was it more like you were given a couple of songs to transcribe? How did that go?
Yeah, I was pretty much just given a couple songs to transcribe.
I gotcha.
It was originally going to be called Twisted Flipper, And then there was,
I'm kind of glad they didn't call it that.
Yeah.
so yeah, there were some issues with that. But yeah, so there are a couple licensed songs. Dr. Feelgood is in it. Home Sweet Home is in it. And again, I did my best. Remember I said the limitations of the pinball system was we could only play 8 sounds at once using FM. Well, the Genesis, same thing, except it's only 6 sounds at once.
Right.
So it was, yeah, let me try and transcribe these best I can to 6 voice simple FM synthesis, which was kind of fun. And then they just kind of wanted a rocking, right? They like the Black Knight 2000 track and like, hey, can we kind of have that similar kind of high energy, FM synth guitars and a kind of driving bass thing. So that's where most of these tracks came from is, stylistically similar to what I had done for Black Knight.
Makes sense. We have noticed that as we were going through the music pretty, tightly last night, Gene and I were going, there's something about your sound. We can almost pinpoint every track that you've done. I mean, obviously there's variation, but there you definitely have,
like a house style.
You have a style. Yeah. Let's get into a track here from Desert Strike on the Genesis. I believe this was, this is the title track. Yeah. Give it a shot. Let's take a listen. All right, that was the title from Desert Strike on the Sega Genesis. And I believe Rob Hubbard composed some of the tracks on this game as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah, it was really fun to collaborate with Rob, just because he's such a, literally a legend.
Yeah.
Of the stuff. He predates me by a few years in game audio. But for the title track, they wanted something, because so I had done Crüe Ball. That was my first game with EA, and then they asked me, "Hey, we want something similar for like the opening theme to Desert Strike." Again, that kind of rocking, heavy bass. I think you were just talking about it a few minutes ago. Kind of like the, I guess by this time I had been put into a style bucket.
Yeah, I know that happens.
So it's fine. I did the same. And later I did Mutant League Football, which also kind of wanted that same kind of vibe.
Actually, Desert Strike just recently came up. A few episodes back, we had Neil Biggin on, and he was a very big fan of your work. I mean, he's another composer of his own legacy. I mean, he's very, very accomplished, but he was very inspired by your work and Rob Hubbard's work. And he did, I think, I know he did some of the ports, but I'm trying to remember. I think it was the PC one and a couple of others. So,
okay,
even other composers are looking up to the work that you guys did over there.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was fun because again, I did the music for the Genesis and the Super Nintendo version, but then EA handled the various ports, and I was happy that they kept with the same opening theme, which was kind of fun.
So we've primarily talked about your FM stuff at this point. We have a track here from Madden 95 on the Super Nintendo. This is the halftime track. It's really cool, and I'd like to talk more about your jump over to some sample-based stuff. So let's take a listen. We'll be right back. God, I really love this track. This is the halftime track from Madden 95 on the Super Nintendo. Tell us about Madden 95. And
It's funky.
yeah,
Yeah, I had fun. I managed to do the I forgot how many years of Madden I did. It was, I don't know, 3 or 4, including the first PlayStation version, which was really fun.
Oh, cool.
So this was a little bit different. All the other games that I've done, except for the Super Nintendo, I used a sound driver I wrote myself. So oh, that's right, I can get techie here.
Yeah.
So I wrote a audio driver that used the same note list kind of style that Williams had, which was the note list style of academic computer music at the time. Languages like Music 4, Music 4F, Music 5, and so on. And I wrote a version of it in C instead of assembly, because C is way easier. It also allowed me to port it to multiple systems much more easily. So I would use a 6809 C compiler if I was doing arcade games for Data East or Sega. I would use a Z80 compiler if I was doing it for the Sega Genesis. I'd use a Z80 compiler with a different sound chip backend if I was using it for the like Chuck E. Cheese kind of games that I was talking about before. So that's how the way I write music is typically I get a pencil and manuscript paper and I just write without a DAW or anything. I just write down the notes. And then I would transcribe those notes from my music paper into text. With Madden and with the SNES games that I did for EA, I did it differently because I was not using my own sound driver. I was using the sound driver written by the people at Visual Concepts, who were developer that EA had hired to do these games. John Schappert, Jason Anderson wrote it. And that was a little bit more MIDI based. So it wasn't straightforward because it's not like we had a MIDI jack in the Super Nintendo and I could just play sounds. I would generally have to create a version of... so the Super Nintendo does not use FM synthesis. The Super Nintendo is more like the BSMT 2000 in that you download short little waveforms, a short snare, a short bass, a short trumpet. They had to be really, really short. Really, really, really short. And then you could, using this sound driver, if I gave it a MIDI sequence, it would play the song using the notes of that MIDI sequence. So these songs were generally played in by keyboard and then edited and then transferred over to the Super Nintendo. And that's one of the reasons they sound a little bit different is I implemented them very differently and I wrote them a little bit differently. And it's, this song again, obviously is a very bass heavy song just because that's the thing I know. And
That's the Brian Schmidt style.
Brian Schmidt.
that's what they want. Yeah. But yeah, it was a lot of fun doing the Maddens.
Cool.
In fact, I eventually got a MIDI bass controller.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a PV MIDI bass, which is it's a bass guitar where the frets are all wired. So you can tell, and it also has sensors by the bridge.
Oh,
So
wow.
it knows what string you're playing. It can sense how tense it is. So if you do vibrato, it can do it. It'll detect what fret you're pushing down and so on. And I used that on the PlayStation version of Madden. And it really suddenly made these sound chip bass parts sound like they were played on a real bass, because they're not so perfect anymore. They've got the inconsistencies of timing and the inconsistent rests between notes and things like that. So little nuances like that were really helpful.
I think I'll have to splice in a copy of a Madden song from the PS1 version after the show, but we don't have anything pulled up right now.
We do have another sports game from EA though. Ooh. We have a track from the Genesis version of NBA Live 97. This is a pretty cool track. It's track 3. I don't know if it actually has a name, but we liked it. Let's take a listen. All right, that was track 3 from the Genesis version of NBA Live 97, composed by Brian Schmidt. Tell us about this.
Hey, here's another one that I don't remember writing. But yeah, it certainly sounds like me. This is the... again, I started doing a bunch of EA Sports games, Mutant Football League, the NBA series, and I eventually also ended up doing some of the Sega sports stuff. Again, it's that kind of, it's got a very unique sort of snare and hi-hat. Those are both FM synthesis snare hats. So by that time, I had spent a lot of time trying to get a cool Yamaha FM synthesis snare that was nice and crisp, and the hi-hat. And of course, this is a little bit brighter, funkier bass sound. I think I was probably playing a lot more funk then or something.
It was the time.
It was the time.
Playing funk.
Yeah. but it's fun because there's, games like this, there's lots of, there's obviously the main theme, but then there's lots of little bits of interstitial music.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it gives you a chance to say, hey, let's riff on what we had done earlier, but in a little way that you're only going to do it. Again, I don't remember what this track was specifically for.
Could have been picking teammates.
Yeah, it sounded like picking teams or something along those lines.
Yeah, picking teams or picking plays or whatever happens to be. So, wow, that was definitely a blast from the past.
Yeah, and these other tracks going back even further haven't been.
Yeah. Well, some of them I know real well, like any of the Black Knight stuff or Swords of Fury or Narc, that stuff I know like the back of my hand. But it's like, oh right, yeah, an NBA 97 Live, I did that.
Oh yeah, I did that at one point. It's because it's not one of those games that has the name that you just remember, right? It's not like Black Knight or something like that. They had a new game every year.
Every year they have it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Now we do have something here we want to talk about. This is moving ahead
quite a bit,
a bit. But tell us about your work on with Microsoft on the Xbox.
Yeah, the startup sound, iconic. I mean, for starters.
Yeah. So I was super happy as a freelancer. I've been doing it for, several years. I was doing lots of games, having a lot of fun. And out of the blue, I think because of the stuff I was doing with QSound was trying to get into PC sound cards. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the 3D sound technologies that Microsoft was doing with DirectX. And out of the blue, I got a call from Microsoft saying, hey, we may have a job you might be interested in. We'd like you to head up the gaming audio technologies for us here. There was no Xbox at the time. And I knew I didn't want to move from Chicago, but I'd like, hey, I've never been to Seattle. I'll let them fly me out and buy me lunch or something. And the next thing I knew, I was flying my wife and 9-month-old son to Seattle where we were moving. And it was kind of cold turkey because I went from writing music, 6 days a week to not really doing very much at all. And I was originally on the DirectX team. And then a friend of mine, a colleague, Kevin Backus, showed me a slide deck that he was working on with Seamus Blakely, another Microsoft employee, about this thing they wanted Microsoft to do. And it only existed as this PowerPoint deck, and it was called Project Midway. And it was how Microsoft should get into the gaming console space. So that PowerPoint deck eventually became the Xbox.
Wow.
And as a game composer who had done games for, PlayStation and Saturn and Genesis, as an audio technologist, working on designing our console game sound system from scratch, from square zero, was really, really appealing.
Mm-hmm.
So I eventually ended up transitioning. I was on loan to the Xbox team for a little bit, and then I was transitioned over there full time, and basically had a blank slate as what should the Xbox sound system look like. And we were looking at different chip vendors and what kind of software architecture there should be. And so we made an Xbox. It was like in 18 months, we went from being greenlit by, Bill and Steve to being on the store shelves.
Wow.
And at the very end of that sequence, one of the last things that we did was we created the startup sequence. And it was kind of challenging because, there was a visual. It was about 8-second visual, if I recall. And normally it would be pretty straightforward to do that, the sound for that, right? You'd take a video of it, you'd bring it into your DAW, you'd create a sound using all the tools all the sequencers or synths you have.
Right.
And just pop out a 8-second WAV file and boom, you're done. The problem was that because of the technological constraints of the system, the only memory accessible during the boot sequence was this small boot ROM of only 256 kilobytes. And the vast majority of it was used by the Xbox operating system kernel and the animations. And so there was only about 25 kilobytes or 27 kilobytes of data left for sound.
So you're back to your roots.
You're right at home.
You're back to your roots.
So remember that sound operating system I said I had written in C and ported to 6809 and Z80?
Right.
Well, I ported it to Pentium.
Wow. Wow.
Did a
that's
quick
incredible.
and dirty version of it and kind of used the same old school arcade techniques to essentially synthesize from scratch the boot sound. So there is no wave file of the boot sound. I didn't create it in a DAW. It's literally made of a sawtooth wave, which I compute on the fly, white noise, which is computed on the fly, sine waves, which are computed on the fly, and a couple really short digitized sounds, but then they're all sequenced in a way, and there's filters that we add to them, so when a low pass filter, so the beginning when it goes,
Yeah.
that's a sawtooth wave, played at a low pitch with a low pass filter that gradually opens up and then gradually closes again. So it was literally using the same system I had written for the Sega Genesis, except ported to the Xbox.
It's still a
That's
very
incredible.
compelling sound. I mean, I have an Xbox, and with backwards compatibility, I can still play original Xbox games. It sounds great on a modern sound system. We actually have a quote here from one of our listeners, Sean Lowen, who says, How do you feel knowing that you made the childhoods or lives of numerous kids and teens with the iconic original Xbox startup sound? It's as iconic as the startup for Windows 95 by Brian Eno, Ryuichi Sakamoto's Dreamcast startup jingle. You know, you are in cherished company over here. So, and that goes for a lot of the other stuff that you've worked on. But, you know, I'm sure it's nice to hear that kind of thing.
I super appreciate that. That's it's very, very nice to hear. It's fun working on a product with a lot of reach. You know, the Xbox was very visible at the time. You know, it was the first console with Dolby Digital built in, and that's a whole nother story about getting that into it. That was really, really fun to do. Came real close to not happening, but we got it done in the end.
And you also worked on the Xbox 360 architecture as well?
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then I left Microsoft. Microsoft got to be a little bit too corporate. If it weren't for Xbox, I would have been out of Microsoft within a year.
Mm-hmm.
The original Xbox felt like a little startup. The team was small. We all knew each other. I knew all the marketing people and the games people and the graphics people. And we were given the power to make decisions really fast because we had to hit the store shelves for Christmas 2001.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so there wasn't time to get bogged down in bureaucracy. And then as the Xbox program grew, it kind of got bigger and bigger, and it got a little less fun to work on. So decided to leave and go back to being freelance.
That makes sense.
Makes sense. Yeah. Gets kind of big and kind of, I guess, too much on rails.
Yeah. It seems like you sort of thrive in that startup-y kind of small team. I mean, yeah.
It really felt like a startup with Uncle Bill writing us checks to keep things going. And the people that were amazing, the team that they put together was just really, really good people. And so being on a small startup team, empowered to make decisions and move fast with really, really smart people was an amazing experience. That was a career highlight.
So we're wrapping up the show here. We wanted to talk about some of your recent stuff that you're working on, like Game Sounds Comp. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, and Game Audio Network Guilds, your involvement in both of those organizations. Hate to skip like 10 years of your career here.
No, that's fine.
Feel free to fill in the blanks as well.
Most of those years were stuck in meetings at Microsoft, so I don't mind skipping over those at all.
I know, yeah. I think Brian and I both understand how that goes quite well at this point in our careers.
So one of the things that was really fun about, again, the early Xbox days was one of parts of my job was to help educate composers and sound designers on how to do sound for the Xbox. Mm-hmm. This was at a really interesting time in the game audio industry. I think it was a major, major inflection point, technically, creatively, and from a business perspective. So it was I'd say 2000, 2001 was a giant, giant change in the industry. And it was because of something as simple as, remember how I said that what I used to fight all along with in game audio is tiny memory, right? 32
yes.
kilobytes for Desert Strike and 64 kilobytes in the Super Nintendo. And with the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox One, that was when games started being delivered on DVDs. And that was the first time it really was possible to say, hey, for this game score, we're going to go to Abbey Road and record the London Philharmonic and record 120 minutes of original score and just plop that into our game. Prior to that, it really wasn't possible to do that.
Right. And
concurrent with that, all of a sudden, you no longer needed my archaic skills of how do I get decent sounds out of a little sound chip. That's a buggy whip skill now. All you need to be able to do is produce awesome music. Turns out there's lots of people that are really good at that previously were unable to do games because they didn't have this archaic skill set that they needed.
Right.
But with DVDs, with the Xbox One and the PlayStation 2, they didn't need those skills anymore. They could focus on getting people who just were awesome composers. And that's where you started having composers like Marty O'Donnell come in, or Gordy Hobb, or Michael Salvatore, and Will Roget, just awesome composers. Well, what I discovered while I was trying to teach these new aspiring game composers, again, typically coming from Hollywood or other places, they were all stumbling over the same issues when it came to writing music for games, and that it's not so straightforward and it's not linear. And how do you deal with that? And there are these technological handcuffs you still have on you. And I was just finding myself talking to people over and over and over again about these same issues. People skilled in composing and sound design for linear media needed a lot of being brought up to speed for games. So when I left Microsoft, I had kind of a 3 or 4 pillar plan in my back pocket. One was I wanted to go back to freelance composing. I'm working on Mutant Football League 2 now. That's
nice.
My current game, which is ironically inspired by the Mutant League Football, which was a EA Sega Genesis game. But that's a slight digression. So one of the pillars was, hey, I bet there's a market out there for educating people who want to know how to create music. They're good at that, but they don't know how is writing music for games different than writing music for more traditional media. And so that's where QSound came from. I was like, let me do a 2-day crash course in game audio. I had my first one down in LA in 2009. And I think there were about 40 people that showed up. And the panelists were great. Marty O'Donnell spoke. Guy Whitmore spoke. Nile Rodgers was one of my speakers. It's like I was like, whoa.
You always manage to scare up some really awesome guests. Every time I see it, as not an audio professional, it's a little bit steep for me, but I've been wanting to go for years now. It's a really cool event. For those of you who are aspiring audio engineers or people that want to work in games, QSound is definitely worth going.
Yeah, QSound eventually became it started growing, and so it grew beyond just for aspiring composers and sound designers, and I started having a lot more experienced composers and sound designers, and we went online for a couple years during COVID, which was great fun, but learned a lot, and then we came back in 2022. We're sort of full force in person again. We had 500 people in person.
Wow.
And another 350 or so online. We decided to make it a full-fledged live streamed event. So you have to come visit it sometime.
Yeah. Well, definitely.
Amazing.
It's not super far from us. It's just down in Los Angeles. I'm sure this year's, fingers crossed, this will be the year that we go.
All right.
Yeah. I also wanted to follow up. I think you were very heavily involved with Game Audio Network Guild, which I know is a totally separate organization. I can't remember, were you president or you were pretty high level at some point, something like that?
Yeah, so Gang was founded in 2002, and it was, sort of started in the, hey, we game audio people don't get no respect kind of thing.
Fair enough.
But it was founded by Jack Wall and Tommy Tallarico. So I was on the original board of directors.
Oh, cool.
And the goal of the organization is to sort of foster recognition, advocacy, education, and networking amongst people within the game audio community, and also as an advocate for outside the game audio community. And then was elected president of it 10 or 11 years ago, and have been president ever since. So we put on the Game Audio Network Guild Award show every year at the Game Developers Conference. We got pretty involved this year with the new Grammy category. So we acted as a conduit for game composers to be able to submit their game soundtracks to be eligible for a Grammy nominee this year. So we see that as in line with one of our core pillars, the advocacy and recognition.
I was wondering what that, because we talked to Charlie Rosen of 8-Bit Big Band right before they won, and it seemed like just shortly after that was when the category became official, and I wasn't sure where that push was coming from. It sounds like a lot of it was coming from Gang, which is really cool.
That's overstating Gang's impact. Although the first time we tried to get the Recording Academy, which back then was called NARAS, the National Association of Recording Arts and Sciences, we approached them actually back as far as 1998. And essentially tried to educate them that, hey, game audio isn't all bleeps and bloops anymore.
Yeah.
We were starting to get orchestral soundtracks. There were some CD games that were made. And at the time, game soundtracks were not even eligible. There was, I think the closest category was Best Instrumental Composition Written for Film or Television.
Oh, yeah.
So games weren't even eligible. After meeting with us about a year later, they did add or other visual media to the film and television category.
Almost.
Close.
So after, 2 years of lobbying, and we got 4 words added. And then over the years, there was no category, but games kind of worked their ways into the Grammys.
Mm-hmm.
In 2010, I think it was, Christopher Tin's song Baba Yetu
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
it won the Grammy. Now, it didn't win technically as a game submission. He had a album he had released, and he won in a different category. I think it was Best Arrangement, Original Arrangement Accompanying Vocals.
Okay.
But the song was originally written for Civilization 2 a few years earlier. So in 2012, Austin Wintory's soundtrack for the game Journey was actually nominated in the category I mentioned before that included film and television scores.
Right.
He lost that year to the Trent Reznor's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie soundtrack. And in 2022 or 2021, 8-Bit Big Band won for a cover of a game song from Kirby. And then thanks to a bunch of ongoing behind the scenes stuff last year, the Recording Academy actually created its own category, Best Score Soundtrack for Video Games and Other Interactive Media.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I believe Assassin's Creed won that.
Assassin's Creed Valhalla won that. Stephanie Nakamu was the composer for that. So we were really excited. I got to go to the ceremonies, the award show this year, and it was just awesome to see a video game category.
Yeah, you've had such an incredible and influential impact on game audio over the years, and we're wrapping up our show, but we can't say thank you enough for making the time to come chat with us today. If you want to know more about our show, you can check us out online at pixelatedaudio.com for the show notes and the track list. We're also on Discord, which you can join and chat with a lot of people that have been asking these questions and future questions for other composers or guests that we have on the show.
Yeah. And if you're new to our show, check out some of our past shows. We often feature composer interviews or musician audio professional interviews. We just spoke with Neil Biggin a few episodes back, as we mentioned. That was a really, really great show. Just look back. We have so many great shows.
We do have a track that we want to take out the show with. But before we get to that, Brian, is there any additional plugs or any information that you want to share with us and listeners about what you're currently working on or where to find some of your work currently?
Oh, wow. Thanks. Yeah, like I said, I'm currently audio director for a company called Digital Dreams Entertainment. We're working on Mutant Football League 2, which is the same designer as the EA Mutant League football game I did for the Genesis back in 1992.
Awesome.
Which is amazingly fun. Or with him on that.
Oh, I bet you guys are having a blast.
It's super fun. We shipped the first version in 2017. We've been doing yearly updates, and we're doing a big overhaul for PS5 and Series X. And we're diving into things like AI voices and just trying to get some cool cutting edge tech into it. And it's fun to be able to get back to writing some tunes again for sports games. So it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, speaking of which, we wanted to end the show on something you've done recently. And so we have a track here from Mutant League Football from 2017. It's called Cold Steel and Ice. Tell us a bit about this track before we say our farewells.
Yeah, this is for the parody team of the Buffalo Bills, the Snuffalo Thrills. And they're looking kind of for a driving kind of Peter Gunzy kind of, give a little hint of gangsterness here and there. And so I had a track that I decided to write from the bass up and see how it turned out.
Awesome.
Oh, fun part on this one is the drummer on this one is Todd Zuckerman, who is the drummer for Styx.
Oh, cool.
Oh, very cool.
He and I actually played in a wedding band for several years back in the 90s, actually when I was doing all the Sega Genesis stuff.
Oh, that's very cool.
So listen to the drum parts. There's some great drumming in this track.
Awesome. Well, again, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you and your learning more about your history and again the mass of span of your career.
This is one for the books.
This is one for the books. Taking out the show, we got Cold Steel and Ice. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all back in a few weeks for the next episode.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast a trip down memory lane for me. Appreciate it.
Awesome.